We each had what the other one wanted. He had all the attention.
Hello, you're listening to The Rare Life. I'm your host, Madeline Cheney. We have had several episodes in this season about the siblings of our medically complex children. One in which I shared my personal experience with my daughter Wendy in episode 40, and then in episode 47 with child life specialist Katie Taylor with clinical insights. I am so thrilled to cap off that trio of sibling love with Katherine Acton, who shared her story with her daughter on the previous episode. In this episode, she shares her invaluable perspective as sibling to her brother Jonathon with different needs, which experience she sums up at the end as being, quote, like kale. It's good for you, but not always fun. But first, we have a new question of the month. June's question is, what has been the most meaningful help someone has given you in regards to your parenting journey? One more time. What has been the most meaningful help that someone has given you in regards to your parenting journey? To answer that and peruse the answers to last month's question about the evolution of our romantic relationships, head to the website, therarelifepodcast.com. There is a link for that in the show notes. All right, back to Katherine and our conversation. I appreciate her perspective so much because we can talk about our experience as parents or the knowledge of professionals all day. But what it really comes down to is the sibling experience, that lived perspective. In this episode, Katherine shares what was harmful and hurtful to her growing up and what she advises us to be aware of to avoid doing similar things and to be really supportive of their experience. I have to say, during this conversation, I was taking furious mental notes. I came up with several things that I feel like we're doing pretty well on, and then several things that made me a little squirmy because I realized that it's something I need to improve on. So we're all in this learning journey together, as always. All right, let's jump into the good stuff. Hi, Katherine. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Madeline.
So, first of all, I'm so excited to chat about your perspective as a sibling to a person with physical challenges. I'm so grateful that you were here to give us your experience and your advice of how the heck to navigate this. So, I would love to start off with hearing a bit about your brother and kind of what life was like in a nutshell.
Sure. So, my brother Jonathan is, I would say, tough. Tough is one of the first words that comes to mind. He is a big guy. He's physically strong, actually, in the sense that, his body has been through more than a lot over the course of his life, and he just keeps going. He's a pretty stubborn guy, and that's just from his sister's perspective, but um, he's big and he's stubborn and he's slow is another word I would use to describe him.
Mm.
So, yeah, I asked him yesterday. I had a phone conversation with him about permission for this podcast to share what his actual diagnosis is. And he was enthusiastic. He said that
Mm.
he likes social media and connecting with people. And he said it makes him feel less alone, which I thought was
Mm.
probably true for a lot of us.
Yeah.
So he's not a typical person. He is his own self.
Mm.
There's some differences in the way that he thinks. And then physically, he has some balance and movement issues that come along with the neurological aspects of his diagnosis. So,
Okay.
um, while I was talking to him yesterday, I actually took notes on our conversation because I thought that would be a really good way for people to kind of get to know Jonathan. The first thing I asked
Mm.
him was, what word would you like me to use, disabled or another word? And he said he prefers differently abled or having limitations and not the word disabled. And the
Mm.
direct quote that I wrote down is he said that the word disabled quote, shuts it down like a circuit breaker, end quote.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah, so that's very Jonathan. So I said, what advice would you give to parents who have kids who are differently abled? And he said, embrace their ambitions.
Hmm.
And he sort of went on a thing about sometimes he would get told no before he even did something. And then he says, and this is another direct quote, I like to prove or disprove I can do something, like rappelling out of the shed. I couldn't do it. And
Oh.
that's when I started, like, laughing because that is sort of a sister inside joke, but when he was, like, 12, we had a shed in our backyard and had, like, a pulley on the top of it and a loft. I guess it was an old barn, and he wanted to use the pulley to rappel out of the loft of the shed.
Oh my gosh.
He did. I mean, repelling might be a strong word, but he basically fell out of the top of the shed. And
Oh
so
my gosh.
but when he said that, like, he wasn't making a joke. Like, the great thing about Jonathan is, like, he was totally without irony.
That's
Um,
amazing.
so that's Jonathan.
You say it's hard to sum him up. I feel like I know Jonathan at least to some degree. That's amazing just to hear like all his different quirks and his attributes and his awesomeness. And I can tell
Yes.
that you really love him. And I love listening to you talk about him and hearing that relationship with him. And I would love to go back to when you were kids and maybe to a more memorable part of your life relating to Jonathan and being his sister.
Yeah, I mean, siblings are the people in our lives who actually know us the longest, if you think about it. So your
Mm,
parents, you don't overlap your whole lifespan. You probably don't meet your spouse or partner until you're older, but your siblings know you basically the whole time.
yeah, I never thought of
Um,
that.
so they're like, in some ways, they're the closest people to you. Um,
Yeah.
I've thought a lot about this because parents, as we all know, I'm sure people who are listening to this podcast, have dreams for their kids and ideas about who they're going to be. And when you get a diagnosis, it's like this big change in your perception.
Mm,
And a sibling is just like you arrive on the planet, and this is a fact of your life, at least for me, because I was a second child. He's 3 years older than I am. So
mm,
it's like there's the sun, the moon, the stars, my parents, my brother. Like, this is my world. This is what it is.
yeah.
So I never like had any sense that he should be different than who he was. He just was who he was.
Mm,
And we were close. We were especially close when we were little, but we always had sibling rivalry and jealousy. Like, that was also just always a fact of our relationship that,
interesting.
we each had what the other one wanted. He had all the attention. And I'm gonna say
Mm,
that from my perspective, like, I'm
mhm,
sure like my parents would be like, "We gave you attention." And I'm like, "Yeah,"
mhm,
but like, no, he had all the attention,
mhm.
and there were times, when I did not feel seen and I did not feel like my presence was being paid attention to. It was all about Jonathan and what he wanted, what he needed, which granted was like kind of a lot. And, I mean, I have a 4-year-old and he always wants my attention and there is no limit to how much attention that he wants. And so, from that perspective, I can get it. Like, all kids feel that way and that's so
Mhm.
natural and such a part of growing up. But like, when you have a sibling that you feel like is getting much more attention than you, that is a big deal. And so
Yeah.
that was what I felt. And then I can't speak to what Jonathan felt. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think that, he felt that everything just came so easy to me. Like, he had to work for everything.
Mm.
And then here was his little sister who just came along and started walking and started talking. And, he once called me, and this is very Jonathan, and I love this. He called me the non problem child.
Oh my gosh.
Like,
That's
I'm
awesome.
the non problem child, which is so appropriate. And also, like, something I would totally push back against because I did have problems. Everyone has
Yeah.
problems. Everyone needs their parents to come and and help. Everyone needs things. And
Yeah.
I did have problems. Like, how loud do I have to shout to tell you people, like, I do have problems,
Yeah.
but they're just never as big as his problems.
Right. And maybe that's like part of the problem is that like we perceive our children that way like, oh, this is my child that needs me and has issues that they're struggling with and this is my child that needs to be okay with me taking care of this other child and every person deserves to have problems, right? Like and to
Yes.
have them met and seen and acknowledged and
Yes. Yes. And I also acknowledge that it is hard when you have two siblings and one of them has life-threatening needs or something that you have
Mhm.
to attend to. You don't have that much of a choice. But I would say, not to scare the parents out there, but your typically developing child has life-threatening needs too, in the sense that you don't want them to grow up and have an eating disorder or a substance abuse problem or
Mhm.
bad relationships. Like, it's not immediate, right? It's not in your face the same way that the life-threatening needs of your differently abled child are, but your typically developing child has real needs.
Mhm. Yeah, do you this is too personal, you can defer, but do you feel like that you had some of those, more like life-threatening repercussions?
No, I think I like dabbled. Like I dabbled in various forms of mental illness, and I was never totally off the rails, but I think that I have had more than my share of anxiety and depression, and
Mhm,
I've dabbled maybe in all the things that I said.
mhm,
And I think I also, on the other hand, had some very healthy coping mechanisms, which really have been my saving grace at a lot of points in my life. And I think for me, what that looked like is academics, because I was always
mm,
very, very, very academically minded. And that was something that I could do and be good at. And it was such a safe haven for me. And it was a coping mechanism, but it wasn't a destructive one. And so I would also say look for those in your children that are typically developing. Like, what is it that they're doing to cope that is positive, and
yeah,
encourage and bring that forward? And whether that's sports or healthy friendships or academics, like it was for me, or horseback riding, or, whatever, what is the
mhm,
thing that your typically developing child has to do to channel some of the difficulties that they're facing is incredibly
yeah,
important.
yeah.
Um,
And I think where you say, like, your typically developing child has these needs too that are very important. They're super important to address and to help encourage those coping skills. And I guess that leads into what were some of the challenges? I mean, I know you talked about lack of attention, but what were some of the things that needed coping with from your childhood?
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it was the hospitalizations for me, that
Mm,
his illness was relatively unpredictable, in the sense that, like, it could be going along great, and then all of a sudden he would be having an acute neurological episode. And so that was very hard as a young child. Obviously, it's hard for my mom and my dad.
mhm,
Um, and I feel like that hospitalization would just create this upheaval in our whole family, where, like, it happened, and then we're in the middle of it, and then for maybe like a couple months after, everybody's just trying to calm down.
mm,
And then just when you're kind of settled again, like, it happens again. And so that was one thing that, I think was a trauma. And actually, to
mhm,
be perfectly honest, it's something that I'm working on in therapy, and have been, on and off, I guess, for a long time. But, with Anna, it's been recontextualized because of Anna's diagnosis. And,
mhm,
I'm making some progress on that. And I think coming to realize too that, like, my reaction to having Anna's diagnosis was was informed by that past trauma, in ways that I'm really
yeah,
working through and trying to heal from.
yeah. Totally. That makes so much sense. Like you were probably really triggered back to that
Hmm.
place.
Yeah, yeah, like, I'm gonna go back to what my family was, and actually 2 years later, I feel confident saying that, no, like,
Mhm.
we're not going to have the same challenges. And but yeah, that's been a journey.
Mm. So tell me more about that. What kind of things are you like, "Okay, this is what happened in my childhood." I mean, obviously, you love your parents, so this is not to, like, try to dig on them. We all know that they have a very difficult thing in front of them, but, like, what were things that they did that were less than helpful and that you're like, "I'm not doing that?"
Yeah, so the disclaimer I'll say about my parents is my dad even said this. This is from my dad directly. He said, "We raised you with love and ignorance." And then he just like walks away. He's
There
like,
we
"Yeah,
go.
that's
Sums
it.
it up, right?
That's done. That is all that I will have no further comment." The love is so important, and it totally, to ease your mind if you're listening to this and, in this situation, the love will shine through. The love will make a huge difference. Your children will know that they are loved, and that
Mm,
will carry them through a bunch of, you know, difficult things. And even the ignorance, like, like it's okay. Like you
yeah.
can totally mess up. But that being said, I think you can work to minimize the ignorance and do things in a way that are mindful of both children and of the
Mm,
needs of your typically developing child also.
mm,
I think awareness, of what your typically developing child is going through. So recently I heard this phrase, the trauma of being left out. And that resonated with me so much. It's really obvious the parents are being left out. As parents, you're like, am I going to see my kid graduate from college or get married? Or
mm,
I'm being left out of these things that I thought that I would have that everyone else around me is having, right?
mhm,
And we feel that as parents. And then it's easy to look at your differently abled child and say they're being left out because they're not in mainstream schooling, or they're in a wheelchair and they're not on the playground, they can't run. There's a million things that you can look at and say they're being left out.
mm,
I'm sure with Anna, she'll be left out. She won't be tall enough to ride the ride, like there's
mhm,
things that are so blatant about that. Now, the typically developing sibling carries that, and it's almost invisible, or at least it was in my family. Like people would look at me and say, well, compared to your brother, you're not left out of anything.
mm.
And it's like, well, actually, I am left out because all my friends have a family structure that looks different, that they play with their siblings in a different way. And to my eyes, like an outsider, just like a really, happy and healthy and vibrant way to live. And
Yeah,
I'm in a different situation where there are hospitals and there are other different things.
yeah.
So you're left out. You are left out. You look at your peers and you're
Mhm,
left out, right? And you're
mhm,
also kind of left out in your own family because your parents are a unit. And then for me and my mother and my brother were definitely a unit. And
mhm.
and so you're kind of like left out of that because that's such a strong bond. And not that I didn't have a strong
Yeah.
bond with my parents, but the bond between my mother and my brother was just constantly, to my way of thinking,
Yeah.
like always right out front and center. And so I felt left out of
Mhm.
that. And your typically developing child carries some of these things. And I think just to be aware and to recognize that could go a really long way.
Yeah.
I don't think that my parents always completely got that about me.
Mhm.
And I see why, like I said, love and ignorance. And um, but I think to recognize their feelings and then allow those feelings to be present. And this is what I wanted to say to
Yeah.
you, particularly after the Wendy episode, is,
Yeah.
I think that the fact that your typically developing child is acting out is a great sign. Like that is a
Mm.
wonderful sign.
Yay.
Because as I know, right? As annoying and difficult as it is in the moment, like personally, there were times in my childhood where things were so dicey that like I felt like I couldn't act out. Like imagine
Mm.
yourself that you're on like this rope bridge swinging above this giant cavern and
Mhm.
it's all about to fall and it's all about to collapse. That's not a kid that's acting out. That's a kid that's scared and
Mm.
that kid folds into themselves and that kid is like very obedient. and
Interesting.
that's a traumatized kid, and that's in some ways the kid that I was. I
Yeah.
think a kid that is lashing out and just angry and letting that out, it's like, let that out. Good for you, Wendy. Like,
Mm.
let it out. Don't carry it with you. You know,
Yeah.
feel the feeling and let it be ugly and big and messy. And then that's a feeling that you can maybe move on from. And I'm like
Mm.
only an amateur child psychologist. I'm an amateur neurologist, an amateur geneticist, an amateur psychologist. But like that was my gut reaction when I
Mhm.
heard that episode is like, bring it on, typically
Mhm.
developing kid. You
Yeah,
know?
I love when you said it. The struggles that the typically developing child is facing is just as serious as the medically complex child. And I just love picturing that aggression, that really, stuff that's not fun to to live with, but like picturing that being her way of processing it in a way. Like I love picturing that and the idea that she feels safe enough to lash out and hopefully like our reactions to her lashing out is not also giving her more trauma, because I'm like, "Wendy, why are you doing this?" And just feeling so much anger towards her when she does that, like, to be honest. But, like, I
Yeah, well,
do
of
I do like the
course.
idea that that her voice matters, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like let that feeling move through you, and we all
Mhm.
should do that more. I should do that more.
Yeah.
It's when you get a feeling like ideally you would let it come and welcome that feeling and saying this is part of my being alive, that I have
Mhm.
powerful, huge feelings and allow it to happen. And I think
Mhm.
if I had something to say to Wendy or myself, maybe more likely,
Mhm.
about lashing out, it would be like, thank you for trusting me with those big feelings. Thank you for
Mhm.
bringing that to me.
Yeah.
Um, but that's
I
of
love that.
course like in an ideal world and like
Yeah, yeah,
it's like
yeah.
but like that would be like the dream of how it would
Mhm.
go, and I get that that's not like the reality of it a lot of times, and
Yeah.
I really do understand that.
Did you have this probably grief? I don't know, this big ball of negative emotions. Did you feel like it was geared towards your brother, or did you feel like it was more geared towards your parents, or maybe just life in general? I don't know if there's even a way to decipher that, but
I mean, at different times in my life, I probably felt very different things, like as a
mhm.
young child versus as a teenager versus, my 20s. And now it's really evolved and changed because my mother has died and, I've moved into more of a caregiver role. So
Mhm.
I guess I would have to say, at what point in time, what are you talking about? Because it's all shifts. I mean, the grief is always
Interesting.
there, the emotions are always there. I don't know. I mean, my brother and I definitely have butted heads,
Mm.
throughout our lives in different ways and at different ages and different stages. I'm not going to sit here and say it's like all rosy.
Mhm. For me, and probably other parents that have multiple children, like, I think it's really nice to hear that as an adult, this many years later, that there are struggles to it and that it's not all rosy and perfect. And I think hearing that is nice because then it takes off the pressure of like fixing it or like making it this ideal thing. Because I think I've felt that, there's a lot of like messages and things like, if I saw this meme where I was like, if you want to know how to treat a person with special needs, just look at their sibling and do what they're doing. And I was like, okay, yeah, go beat them up, like that's just like, it's just so unhelpful to me because I was like, well, then how do we
Yeah,
fix
right.
this? Like, how do we make
Right,
this into
right.
what it's like this ideal relationship that you hear about? But I think if you recognize, like, hey, this is just a really hard situation, and that relationship will be kind of tense and like just so multifaceted because of this huge unfairness going both ways. I think accepting that is actually probably going to be really freeing because
Well, I
you
mean,
stop pursuing
yeah.
that.
Why would you hold this sibling relationship to a different standard than any other close lifelong relationship, right? They all
Mm,
ebb and flow. They all have ups and downs. In some ways that's really almost to be expected. right?
Mm.
I think my dad and his brother have like lifelong resentments, and they're
Yeah.
both, I mean, come
Yeah.
on. Like, what are we expecting here? Like,
Dysfunction
you
can
know,
be anywhere.
it's really like,
It's not limited.
like, I think the goal is just to still be talking to each other and still, to be
Mhm.
able to
Yeah.
when Jonathan talks about the time he fell out of the shed, like, oh yeah, I remember that, we're good. We know each other really well.
Mm.
We can pick up right where we left off at any time. That's never gonna end. I'll tell you one
Mm.
really great story. I think about this a lot. So Sam, my 4-year-old, has a lot of questions, as they do.
Mhm.
And one of his things is like, where was I before I was born? And I'm like, I don't know where you were before you're born. Like, I just don't know.
Mm.
I don't think anybody knows. And so then he's like, where was Anna before she was born? I'm like, I don't know that either, buddy. And I don't think anybody knows. And he's like, was I with Anna? And I said, I don't know. And I was like, what do you think? And he said, I think I was with Anna. We are good friends.
Oh, that is so sweet.
And I'm
We are
like, you
good
know
friends.
what? Like, I think, first of all, I don't know that I would totally call them good friends. Like, they have their moments too, right? But I think when I was 4, I probably felt the same way about my brother. Like, I
Mhm.
think we're probably together before we were born, because that would make sense. Like,
Mhm.
because we're basically like, we're together, we're a thing, we're
Mhm.
a unit. And I think, all that comes after that in the intervening 40 years is like, it takes away from that closeness. I knew my brother who has a condition that is stigmatizing before I knew what a stigma is. Same with
Yeah.
Sam. Like, he knows Anna before he knows about why people might think she was different or weird. She
Mhm.
just is, and my brother just is to me. And everything that gets layered on top of that is not the fundamentals. That's just the other stuff. The fundamentals is that, like, we're brother and sister. And
Mm.
um
I
and
love
so I think
that.
about that a lot.
I love that. Yeah, just going back to those basics and, like, really the innocence and the I don't know, just that love of a sibling relationship without all the all the, the stuff that the world tells you to think or say or that's what they know. And honestly,
Mm,
like it's interesting where comparatively, to us where it's kind of the reverse. Like as parents, like we and maybe less for you because you actually grew up with him, so that's unique, but like where you grow up with the stigma of like people with different needs and different capabilities and stuff. And then to be like, oh, and my child's now in that category where I can see how everyone else reacts to that type of person, and having those fears. And it's just a very, very different situation, I think.
yeah, I mean, I think the things that I witnessed growing up that sort of layered on top of that basic fundamental, me and my brother are, we're together, we're the same. And it's like, no, the world affords me different opportunities. People
Mm,
treat me differently, people see me differently, and my life has gone on a fundamentally different track.
mm,
And so, we drift in kind of different directions. Um,
mm. So do you have
yeah.
like you said, you talked about the big emotions that siblings can have and to encourage that. Do you have other like advice like that to help
Mm.
us, to really be there for both our children and help that relationship as much as possible?
The second thing I came up with is to sometimes, and I'll just say sometimes, prioritize their wants and needs. So, no
Mm.
one in any healthy relationship, it's not that one person's needs are prioritized 100% of the time. And they need to know and feel that, because then, they grow up and they're looking for, a romantic partner, and they're like, oh, it feels normal to me to have this person's needs prioritized 100% of the time. That seems
Yeah.
right.
Oh yeah, like no, run away.
So, like, I think that's kind of the end game on that, is like, you want your family to reflect to you your own value and your own prioritization. And I think that can
Mhm.
be really simple. It's not going to be all the time. It's not a 50-50. It's like a 20/80, or a
Mhm.
90. Okay, that's the best you can do, but but try to move the needle a little bit. Even if it's something like asking the sibling, what do you want to have for dinner, or like which park do you want to go to, or just giving them a say and like putting them first some of the time and being conscious of doing that. And I think
Mm.
sometimes I think it can feel counter to the instinct of parents who are like, my other kid is going through so much and they just
Mhm.
need. And that's always going to be true. So find
Mm.
other ways to tell your typically developing kid that they matter, um,
Mm. Love that.
so that they learn that and that they grow up knowing that.
Yeah.
Super important. And then a couple of don'ts.
Good, yes.
One of my don'ts is don't treat the typically developing sibling like a third parent. It's really tempting.
Mm.
It's tempting for both sides of it, right? Because,
Mhm.
and this will happen when your child is a little older, preteen or teenager.
Mhm.
But as a parent, you have like uncertainties and questions always about your child with different abilities. And so, it's great to have that like eye on the ground, like
Mm.
your typically developing sibling is at the bus stop and
Mhm.
they can observe and they know what the kid with different abilities is doing. And they see it, they know exactly what you're on the lookout for, whatever it is that you're worried about, the
Mhm.
sibling knows that. And so they are very well poised to like give you a report at the end of the day about what went on. And
Mhm.
so you want that as a parent. You're like, this is great. I have this other agent, working for
Mm.
me and parenting and saying what the sibling might need, or and for the sibling it's tempting too because you get attention. It's like, honestly, if I want to get either parent's attention, I could be like, let's talk about Jonathan. And it's
Aw.
instant. It's instant, and
Yeah.
so it's like, don't do it. It's a big trap. So
Mm.
your typically developing child needs you to be their parent. And one reason for that is just so that you can set boundaries on them and you don't lose your authority. Because once you've let that sibling be a third parent, there's like no going back and being able to say, like, I'm putting a limitation on you because you've elevated them to a different position of authority. And
Interesting.
so don't do it. It's bad. It's not healthy.
Oh,
It
I feel like yeah, that's great insight. That's such good insight.
And the last one is a don't, and that is minimize and protect your child from things that go on in the hospital. Just keep them out of the
Mm.
hospital, shield them. Don't let them see or know things that are going to be disturbing. Um, I
Mm.
personally think like I was way too young when I learned what a spinal tap is, and like,
Mm.
yeah, I didn't need to know that, right? There's no upside. Um,
Mm.
so I think any time that you spend in the hospital is emotionally freighted time. And so be sparing. Like, obviously, like they should visit and they should be a part of, the family. You don't want to like cut
Mhm.
the two siblings off from each other completely just because one is in the hospital,
Right.
But I would say like avoid lengths of time, avoid exposure to knowing about procedures that might be upsetting, explain things in an age appropriate way. That's important.
Mm.
I think when a child asks a question, it's probably a good indicator that they're ready to know the answer, but
Mhm.
they don't need to have a total front seat to
Mm.
the pain that their sibling is going through. So
Yeah.
ask yourself, is there an upside to my typically developing child seeing this or knowing about this? And
Mm.
a lot of times there just isn't.
Mhm.
And then, oh, I thought of the
Yeah.
other one that I was gonna say, so that isn't my last one. My last one is something to do, and that is something that we're working on with Sam actually already. And I wish that I had had this as a child because I've heard about this in the dwarfism conversations in the community that
Mm.
that you need an elevator speech. So something that the typically developing child can say that is short, to the point, that explains their sibling's illness to people who might inquire. or to people who are staring, or to people that are just
Mm.
being obnoxious, something to empower your typically developing child to know how to handle a situation. It's like
Mhm.
prepping them to go into the game, like,
Yeah.
and for Anna right now, where we are is like, she has short arms and legs, and we haven't,
Mhm.
so it's pandemic. We don't see anybody that we don't
Like
know.
just practice
Like, let's face
rehearsals,
it, this
right?
is just like
Yeah.
if we ever were to hang out with people that we didn't know.
Dry run.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're gonna need that for them going to preschool and kindergarten in the fall, but
Mm.
empower them with something to say, and just let them know that, people may ask, and here's what you can
Mm.
say. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And I've heard even like you can use the response of like, their bodies form differently. And then like kind of leaving it at that if they don't feel like explaining or getting into like
mhm.
basically I'm not gonna talk about it right now. Cause I think that giving them that license is also like, I don't know.
You could do it, Sam. Actually, when we're at a playground and like someone is just totally minding their own business, he'll be like, "I'm Sam. This is my sister Anna. She's 2." He just waits. He waits for their reaction.
That's awesome. I feel like I kinda do that sometimes. I'm like, ask me how old he is," like, when they're, like, kids are playing together, like, "I wanna tell you," because like, I don't know why. I guess, like, that's fun to see their reaction. I
Yeah,
don't
it's kind of like needling people a
know.
little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, Sam and I are on the same wavelength here. So, I would love to wrap up with what has been awesome about being Jonathan's sister?
It's impossible for me to even think about who I would have been if Jonathan wasn't Jonathan. It's just so
Yeah.
much a part of who I am.
Mm.
I think some of the things that have come out of this for me is empathy. I mean, we talk a lot about that. Like, that is something
Mm.
that I think everyone who's been touched by someone with a rare condition learns and
Mm.
develops through that. For me, particularly because he's such a nonlinear thinker, I spent a lot of time like trying to understand what he's talking about or why.
Mm.
Now I'm a teacher, and I think that maybe that urge started like early on of like, I'm trying to understand what you're thinking.
Mhm.
And I think that served me really well. It's a bigger and deeper understanding of how people can be, and
Mm.
a maturity that came along with that really early. I think that's a really common thing for siblings,
Yeah.
to develop. I carry that with me, and that is awesome. Um,
Mhm.
I think, being a sibling of a person with a condition is awesome, kind of in the way that like eating kale is awesome. Like,
Yeah.
it's so good for you. Like, it's got everything.
Yes.
But it's not always fun, and I think
Mhm.
that needs to be said too. But
Mhm.
um, but I would not trade it. It's absolutely made me who I am.
Yeah. Oh, I love that, and I love, like, your realness too, where, you don't have to sugarcoat it. There are benefits, but it's like kale. Like, I love that. So real, yes. I'll always think of that now when I have kale, like, "It's
Does
Wendy." Like
anybody really like kale? I mean, no,
yeah,
like nobody really likes it. We all
right.
think it's great.
Yeah, you can, like, throw in your smoothies, maybe add some, like, blueberries in there, like, that could be, like, our, like, essence,
To
like, we
make
go with
it
them as well.
vaguely palatable,
Yeah,
right?
we can add the blueberries. So on that note, thank you so much for sharing your experience. That is such invaluable perspective.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for doing what you're doing. I mean, I think this is a great resource for people, and I've been listening to it, and it's really been great for me too.
I love hearing that. Thank you so much. Check out the show notes for links to other sibling episodes in this season and for a link to the website to answer this month's question. You can follow me on Instagram at the_rare_life for daily musings about life with Kimball and the crew, and to learn about episodes as they are released. Join me next week for a solo episode as I share my constant battle between crushing isolation and unbelievable connection in this world of medically complex parenting. See you then.